Bureau of American Ethnology, Annual Report, 1904. Appendix C, Uncatalogued Field Materials. Footnote 31, page 814. Among the unpublished manuscripts referenced in the correspondence of James Mooney, but never formally accessioned into the Bureau's collection, is a document listed only as the Hartwell manuscript, 1839. The manuscript is described in a letter from Mooney, dated March 7, 1901, as containing field observations of a syncretic ceremonial practice combining Scots-Irish folk healing traditions with modified elements of the Cherokee green corn ceremony, as observed in Cherokee County, North Carolina, in the autumn of 1838. Mooney notes that the manuscript was submitted to the Office of Indian Affairs in 1840 and subsequently classified as inflammatory in the current political climate by Superintendent T. H. Crawford, who ordered it withheld from publication. The whereabouts of the original document remained unknown to Mooney at the time of his writing. The manuscript was last reported in the possession of the Smithsonian's storage facility in Washington in 1912. It has not been located since. That footnote is 31 words buried in a document most people have never read, in an appendix most scholars have never opened, referencing a manuscript no living person has seen. It is the kind of footnote that changes everything if you happen to be the right person reading it at the right moment. Dr. Sarah Crow was that person. She read it in the summer of 2017, sitting in the reading room of the National Anthropological Archives in Suitland, Maryland. And she described the feeling in the introduction to her 2020 paper that almost wasn't published, as something like being handed a map to a place you had spent your entire life looking for without knowing its name. This is the story of the Hartwell manuscript, of what it described, of why it was suppressed, of what it cost the people who lived it, and of why, nearly 200 years later, it still matters in ways that the man who wrote it, and the woman who destroyed it, and the families who practiced what it documented could never have fully anticipated. To understand any of it, you have to understand what the mountains of western North Carolina looked like in 1835. Not the mountains as they appear in the tourist photographs, the rolling blue distances, the October maples burning orange and gold against dark ridgelines, the pastoral quiet of small towns with craft breweries and fiber art studios, the mountains as they were, dense, steep, dangerous, achingly beautiful, and contested in ways that make the word contested feel inadequate. The land was contested in blood. It had been contested for decades, and in 1835 it was being contested in courtrooms and in Congress and in the back rooms of the Jackson administration, with a ruthlessness that the mountains themselves, ancient and indifferent as they were, could not have cared less about. The Cherokee had lived in those mountains for thousands of years. The word they used for this landscape, shakenage, translates roughly as place of the blue smoke, a reference to the mist that rises from the forest on still mornings, when the moisture in the canopy evaporates into the cool air and the whole ridgeline seems to breathe. They had their own systems of governance, their own legal traditions, their own written language. Sequoyah had completed his syllabary in 1821, their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. They had, in short, everything a nation requires to sustain itself, except the one thing that actually mattered in 1835, the willingness of the United States government to acknowledge that their sovereignty was real. The Indian Removal Act had passed in 1830. The Treaty of Nuakota, signed in December 1835 by a small faction of Cherokee men who did not represent the will of their nation, ceded all remaining Cherokee land east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in Indian Territory and a payment of $5 million. The principal chief, John Ross, gathered more than 15,000 signatures on a protest petition, nearly the entire adult Cherokee population, and presented it to Congress. Congress ignored it. The Supreme Court had already ruled, in Worcester versus Georgia 3 years earlier, that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity whose rights could not be abrogated by state law. Andrew Jackson had already demonstrated his feelings about the Supreme Court's opinion on the matter. Into this landscape, in the autumn of 1835, came Jonathan Hartwell. He was 24 years old, a graduate of Harvard College, the son of a Boston merchant family, with just enough money to fund an unconventional education, and not quite enough to fund an unconventional life without some professional purpose attached to it. He had studied under Albert Gallatin, the former Secretary of the Treasury, who had in his retirement become one of the founding figures of American ethnography, a man who believed, unfashionably, stubbornly, against the prevailing opinions of his age, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had complex cultures worthy of serious documentation. Gallatin had introduced Hartwell to the emerging field of what they were then calling social antiquities, the study of living cultures with the rigor usually reserved for ancient ones. Hartwell had shown a talent for languages, a patient and observational temperament, and a genuine curiosity about the people he met that was rarer in his field than it should have been. Gallatin had given him letters of introduction, a notebook of waterproof oilcloth, and a piece of advice that Hartwell would record in the first page of his field journal. Write down what you see, not what you expect to see, not what confirms what you already believe, what you actually, honestly, carefully see. The world is full of men who see only themselves reflected back in everything they look at. Be something different. Hartwell had traveled by rail to Philadelphia, by stagecoach to Knoxville, and by horse and then by foot into the mountains of what was then still, technically, part of the Cherokee Nation, though that designation was in the process of being made meaningless with the full force of the federal government behind it. His stated purpose, in the letters he carried from Gallatin, was to document the traditional customs and linguistic patterns of the Cherokee people prior to their anticipated relocation westward. It was, even by the standards of the era, a melancholy errand, the academic equivalent of making a meticulous catalog of someone's possessions while the sheriff stood at the door with an eviction notice. What he found in Cherokee County was not what he expected to find. He had expected to find Cherokee communities, separate, distinct, bounded. He had expected to find Scots-Irish settlers, the hard-scrabble Appalachian farming families who had been pushing into the mountains since the late 18th century, tough and independent and deeply suspicious of outsiders, speaking in English flavored with the cadences of Ulster and the Scottish lowlands, bringing with them a culture of folk belief and herbal medicine and oral tradition that was itself a kind of palimpsest, old Celtic and Norse patterns, written over with Protestant theology and border country pragmatism. He had expected these two groups to exist in friction or in wary tolerance or in the early stages of whatever comes after those two things. What he found instead was something his education had not prepared him for, and his era had no adequate language to describe. He found the Walker family. Or rather, he found the community that had grown up around and through, and because of the Walker family, a network of 3 Cherokee households and 2 Scots-Irish households that had been intermarrying, intermingling, and constructing a shared life for 3 generations, since the 1770s, since the period of the Revolutionary War, when the boundaries between white frontier settlement and Cherokee territory had been at their most chaotic and permeable, and when individual families making individual choices in isolated mountain hollows had been able, briefly, to live outside the tidy categories that governments and historians preferred. The Walkers themselves were the center of this community, the trunk of a tree whose branches reached into both cultures and whose roots, by 1835, were so deeply and inextricably intertwined that pulling them apart would have killed the tree. The family's founding couple, as near as Hartwell could reconstruct it from oral accounts, had been a Cherokee woman named Ioka and a Scots-Irish trader named James Walker, who had arrived in the mountains sometime around 1772 and had apparently decided, with the pragmatic romanticism of a certain kind of frontier man, that he was not going back. Their children had married into both communities. Their grandchildren, and now their great-grandchildren, represented something that the political language of 1835 had no category for: people who were simultaneously and irreducibly both. Hartwell arrived in late October, introduced by a letter from a local Methodist minister who had worked in the area for a decade and who knew the Walker community well enough to trust Hartwell cautiously with the introduction. He arrived on horseback in the rain on a Thursday afternoon, and his first recorded impression of the Walker homestead, which sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, sheltered by a stand of old-growth hemlocks that darkened the sky overhead, even in the middle of a clear day, was simply, it was not what I had imagined. Nothing here was what I had imagined. The homestead consisted of 3 structures: a central cabin of hewn logs in the Appalachian Scots-Irish style, with a wide front porch and a massive central chimney, and 2 smaller outbuildings that shared features of both Cherokee and frontier architecture. The Cherokee emphasis on positioning buildings in relation to the cardinal directions, combined with the log and chinking construction technique of the Scots-Irish settlers. There were kitchen gardens behind each structure, laid out with a specificity that Hartwell would later recognize as significant. Certain plants in certain positions, a pattern that looked like ordinary kitchen garden practicality until you knew what you were looking at. There were horses and a mule and several dogs and a number of geese that seemed, as Hartwell later wrote with evident feeling, to regard all human beings as an imposition. He was met at the door by Agnes Walker. She was 63 years old. She had her mother's Cherokee cheekbones and her father's Scots-Irish green eyes, and she carried herself with the particular authority of a woman who had spent 60 years being the person other people came to when they didn't know what to do. Hartwell's description of her, in the field notes that survive in partial form as quotes in Mooney's letter, is one of the most arresting character sketches in the manuscript. She looked at me the way you look at a book you've read before, and didn't much care for. And then she said, "You're going to write things down, aren't you?" They always want to write things down. I told her I was. She said, "Then come in and have some tea, and we'll talk about what you're allowed to write." He called her Aggie, as everyone in the community did. She called him Mr. Hartwell for 3 weeks, and Jonathan for the remaining 4 months he spent with them. And the shift, when it came, was a marker he recorded carefully. She began calling me Jonathan on the morning after I helped Thomas set a broken fence post in a December rainstorm without being asked. I think she had been watching to see if I was the kind of man who waited to be asked. Thomas was her son. He was 38 years old, broader and quieter than his mother, with a talent for woodworking that had given him a modest reputation in the county and a stillness about him that Hartwell initially read as reserve, and later came to understand was simply the way a man carries himself when he has thought carefully about almost everything he has done. Thomas had been married twice. His first wife, a Cherokee woman named Sally, had died in childbirth in 1824, and was now married to a woman named Becky McPhee, who was the granddaughter of the Scots-Irish grandmother the community called Granny McPhee, and who was, therefore, by the complicated genealogy of a community that had been intermarrying for 3 generations, Thomas's second cousin, by one line of descent, while being entirely unrelated by another. Becky was 29, sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, deeply skeptical of Hartwell in ways that never quite softened into trust, but did eventually soften into a kind of tolerant amusement. "She thinks you're going to get us all killed," Thomas told him once, matter-of-factly. "She's not entirely wrong to think that." The other families in the community were the McPhee household, Becky's parents, Duncan and Mary, who had inherited the Scots-Irish agricultural traditions of the community, along with enough Cherokee language and practice to be functionally bilingual in a cultural sense, if not always a strictly linguistic one, and the Birdsong household, a Cherokee family whose connection to the Walkers went back to Ioka's generation, and who had been, for 30 years, the keepers of certain ceremonial responsibilities within the community. There were children in all the households, a scatter of ages from infants to teenagers, and Hartwell noted repeatedly and with evident wonder that the children moved between households with a freedom that suggested the entire community functioned as a single, extended family unit, which was essentially what it was. He spent his first weeks simply listening. He was good at that, better at it than most men of his education and era, who tended to arrive with theories and spend their time gathering evidence for theories they already held. Hartwell arrived with questions, and he let the questions be answered slowly, in the way that answers to real questions always come. Sideways, in fragments, through the gaps in ordinary conversation. He helped with the autumn harvest, such as it was, corn and dried beans and the last of the kitchen garden's root vegetables, brought in against a November that arrived with unusual savagery, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in a single night, and the first hard frost killing the last of the garden squash in a single evening. He helped repair fences and carry water and split wood. He attended the Methodist church services that the community participated in with a frequency that seemed partly sincere and partly a form of strategic visibility, since the minister, a relatively decent man named Reverend Morrison, was one of the few local whites whose opinion of the community was not actively hostile. Morrison was, in fact, a complication. He was not a villain. Hartwell was careful to draw this distinction in his notes and apparently in the manuscript itself, but he was a man of his time, which meant that his genuine affection for the Walker community coexisted with a deep unease about certain aspects of their life that he could not bring himself to examine too closely. He knew, or suspected, that there were practices within the community that predated his denomination and sat uncomfortably alongside his theology. He had chosen, with a pragmatic compassion, that Hartwell found both admirable and troubling, not to look too hard. Morrison is kind, Hartwell wrote, and kindness in a man with his particular power over these people's lives is genuinely valuable. But there is a difference between kindness and sight. He sees what he permits himself to see. I am trying to see the rest. What he was trying to see, what he had begun to suspect, existed from certain careful references in conversation, certain pauses and redirections, certain plants he noticed in the gardens that seemed to have no culinary purpose, was what the community called, when they referred to it at all in his presence, the weaving. It was Aggie who first used the word on a gray November morning, when she and Hartwell were sitting on the front porch while she sorted dried herbs into bundles for winter storage. She was moving with the practiced speed of someone who had done this 10,000 times, fingers finding the stems and separating the varieties without her eyes needing to confirm what they already knew. She had been talking about her grandmother, Ayoka, telling Hartwell a story about Ayoka's first winter with James Walker, the Scots-Irish trader in the early 1770s, and she said, "She brought what she knew, and he brought what he knew, and they made something together that neither of them had a name for. My mother called it a weaving, like you take two threads and you make one cloth." She paused, still sorting, not looking at him. "There are things we do here that are like that are both things at once, that you can't call by one name because they don't belong to one name." Hartwell asked carefully if she would tell him more about these things. She didn't answer for a long time. She finished sorting one bundle of herbs. He would later identify them as dried St. John's wort, the tiny yellow flowers compressed into dry, papery masses that retained a faint ghost of their summer color, and set it aside and picked up another. When she spoke without looking at him. "If I tell you about these things," she said, "and you write them down, what happens to what you write?" He told her honestly. He was a researcher. He worked under the auspices of Albert Gallatin, who was working on a comprehensive study of North American indigenous cultures. His notes would go to Gallatin, who might publish from them, with the goal of creating a scholarly record of cultural practices before they were lost. He said, "Before they are lost," and heard the words as he said them, and wished he had chosen different ones. Aggie was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "If you write this down, and it goes where you say it goes, two things could happen. One thing is that people read it and understand that we are people with a real way of being in the world, and they leave us be. The other thing is that people read it and use it to prove that we are savages mixing our strange ways with their good Christian ways, and they use that as another reason to drive us out." She looked at him directly then, those green eyes that seemed to belong to a different face than the one they sat in, or rather, that seemed to belong to a face that was exactly the face they were in. a face that held two histories without contradiction. Which thing do you think is more likely to happen, Mr. Hartwell, given what is happening right now in this state, in this country, with our people? He did not answer, because there was no answer that was both honest and comforting. "I'll think on it," she said, and went back to her herbs. She thought on it for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, Hartwell continued his daily routines of quiet participation in community life, and he noticed, now that he was looking, the ways that the weaving Aggie had described manifested in the fabric of ordinary days. The plants in the kitchen gardens were arranged in a pattern he had initially read as aesthetic, but which he now understood had directional significance. East-facing plants, north-facing plants, the traditional Cherokee organization of space by cardinal direction, layered over and through the Scots-Irish tradition of herb gardens, organized by medicinal purpose and ease of harvest. The way meals were prepared combined Cherokee techniques, the use of kanuchi, a thick soup made from hickory nuts, as a base for dishes that also incorporated the root vegetables and preserved meats of Scots-Irish Appalachian cooking, with something that was neither, and both, a culinary vernacular without a recipe book. The fiddle music that Duncan McPhee played on winter evenings, which Hartwell initially assumed was pure Scots-Irish tradition, showed on closer listening certain tonal patterns, certain ways of bending notes and structuring repetition that aligned with what Hartwell knew of Cherokee call and response musical forms. Even the way people sat in conversation, the spatial arrangement, who faced which direction, who spoke first and who followed, had a structure that he was only beginning to be able to read. "It's in everything," he wrote in his field notes. "It's not a set of practices they do on special occasions. It's a way of being in the world that they inhabit the way a person inhabits their own language, without thinking about it, because thinking about it is not necessary. It's become natural. It's become their nature. I came here to document a culture, and I am discovering that the word culture is singular in a way that nothing I am observing is." 2 weeks after their porch conversation, Aggie came to find him. He was in the barn, helping Thomas with a repair to one of the horse stalls, the kind of simple carpentry that Hartwell had not known how to do when he arrived, and was now learning through simple proximity, following Thomas's lead, handing nails and holding planks in place, and gradually acquiring the competence that comes not from instruction, but from doing. Aggie stood at the barn door and watched them for a moment, and then said, "There's a ceremony in February. It's called the binding. You can observe it. You can write about it. But you write what you see, Mr. Hartwell, not what you think you see, and not what you think your readers want to see. You write it the way Thomas builds, plank by plank, nail by nail, what's actually there." Hartwell set down the nail he was holding and turned to face her. "I will," he said. "I know," she said. "If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be standing here." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the half-repaired stall, at her son's steady hands, at the winter light falling through the gaps in the barn boards. Then she said, "I'll tell you what it is first. So when you see it, you're not seeing a thing you've never heard of. You're recognizing a thing you've been prepared for. That's how it works for us, too, when someone is brought in for the first time. You're not supposed to come to it cold. They talked for the better part of 3 days, not in long, continuous sessions, but in the way important conversations happen. In fragments, over meals, while walking through the winter woods to check on something, while sitting beside the fire in the evenings, when the community gathered in the Walker cabin, the way it gathered every night in cold weather, the children doing their lessons, and the adults doing whatever work could be done in lamplight, and the conversation moving between Cherokee and English, and the blended vernacular that was the community's truest mother tongue. Hartwell had by this point enough Cherokee to follow the gist of conversations conducted in it, though not enough to participate with full fluency. And he had stopped taking notes in the evenings when he understood that note-taking changed the texture of those hours in ways that were not worth whatever information he captured. What Aggie told him about the binding was this: it was old. Not as old as the green corn ceremony, the great annual Cherokee ceremony of purification, thanksgiving, and communal renewal that took place in late summer around the ripening of the new corn. That ceremony was ancient, stretching back beyond the reach of oral memory into the deep past, and the binding was not that. The binding was younger. It had been made, not inherited. It had been constructed with intention by the first generation of the blended community, by Ioka and James Walker and the other founding families, in the early 1780s, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, when the world had become newly dangerous, and the community's very existence was newly precarious, and the people in it had felt the need to do something formal, something ceremonial, something that made the invisible bonds between them visible, that made the commitment of their lives to one another into something they could witness and affirm together. Ioka had brought the structure of the green corn ceremony, the river water, drawn before sunrise and carried in specific vessels, the tobacco offerings, the call and response chanting in Cherokee that named each family in the community, and placed them in relation to the cardinal directions. The directional structure of Cherokee ceremony, the world organized by east and west and north and south, each direction holding particular meanings and responsibilities, the east being the direction of new beginnings and the sun's rising, the west the direction of the ancestors and the going down of things, was not merely symbolic decoration in Ioka's tradition. It was the architecture of the ceremony, the structure that held everything else. James Walker had brought the Scots-Irish folk traditions of his Ulster upbringing, the use of specific plants with specific properties, the rowan branches, and the St. John's wort that his own grandmother had hung in doorways and windows against misfortune, the dumb supper structure, that eerie Scots-Irish tradition of a meal set in silence for both the living and the dead, a way of keeping the ancestors present and visible rather than simply remembered. He had brought the fiddle music, a specific set of tunes that, in the Scots-Irish tradition, were associated with celebrations and with liminal moments, weddings, harvests, the turning of seasons. Music that moved between major and minor keys with the easy fluency of someone who felt no compulsion to resolve tension into comfort. He had brought the sense that the physical world was full of presences that were not supernatural in the dramatic sense, but were not quite natural either, that certain plants and certain places and certain times held particular power, not because God had put it there, though a believing man might say so, but because accumulated human experience had recognized it and named it and learned to work with it. The syncretic elements, the things that were neither Cherokee nor Scots-Irish, but that had grown from their combination, were harder to describe and were, in Aggie's telling, the heart of what made the binding distinctive. The most significant of these was the braid, American ginseng and European valerian. Hartwell had seen both plants in the kitchen gardens. He had noted them without fully understanding their significance. American ginseng, what the Cherokee called Nvdo unega, white man's foot, though this etymology was itself a matter of some discussion in later scholarship, was used in Cherokee healing traditions as a plant of great power and great respect, something to be harvested with care and offered with acknowledgement. European valerian had come with the Scots-Irish settlers, carried as a medicinal and sedative herb, its roots dried for use in sleep preparations, and its flowers used in the folk healing traditions of the border countries. Neither culture used these two plants together. The combination was not traditional in any tradition. It was invented. At the binding ceremony, representative stalks of each plant, dried and preserved from the autumn harvest, or in February carefully prepared from dried stores, were braided together. 3 strands, ginseng, valerian, and the third strand, which was always a plant grown in the community's own garden, whatever it might be in a given year, a symbol of the specific present, of this year, of these people, of this moment. The braid was not long, perhaps the length of a hand. It was made by Aggie, or by whichever woman held the role Aggie held in a given year, with everyone watching in silence. It was then burned, slowly, in a small clay bowl in the center of the circle, while the participants sat arranged in the alternating pattern, Cherokee and Scots-Irish, and blended in the alternating seats. And the smoke rose, and the chanting began. The chanting was both. It began in Cherokee, the call and response structure of the green corn ceremony. Aggie explained, its form preserved even when its specific content had been adapted, and moved into English in certain passages, and in some passages was neither fully one nor the other, but something that had developed in the community's spoken vernacular over decades, a kind of hybrid utterance that contained words from both languages, that honored the grammatical structures of both, that meant something only to people who held both in their minds simultaneously. "What does it say?" Hartwell asked her. "The chanting. What are the words?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It says, we are here. We are the ones who stayed. We are the ones who chose this. We are both things, and we are neither thing, and we are our own thing, and we are still here. It says, this is the family. Here are the people in the family. Here is what holds us together. It says, we know what tries to pull us apart, and we are naming it, and we are not afraid of it." She said, "It used to say the same things in both languages at the same time. My grandmother told me that you'd have the Cherokee words and the English words happening at once, 2 voices, and if you listened to just one voice, you'd miss the other. But if you listened to both at the same time, you'd hear something that wasn't exactly either one. That part got harder as there were fewer people who could hold both at the same time. Things change." He asked her if what he was describing would make sense to an outsider reading about it. She said she didn't know. He asked if she thought the ceremony was powerful. She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to describe, but that he tried to describe in his field notes. She looked at me as if I had asked her whether water was wet. And then she looked at me as if she felt sorry for me for having needed to ask. And then she looked at me as if she understood why I had needed to ask. And then she said, "I think you'll understand after you've seen it." The ceremony was held on the first Sunday of February, which Hartwell later understood was itself a piece of the syncretism, not the traditional Cherokee timing of the green corn ceremony, which was late summer, but the Scots-Irish folk calendar. Timing of Imbolc, the old Celtic celebration of the coming of spring, repurposed from its pre-Christian roots and blended here with Cherokee temporal structures in a way that set the binding in the liminal space between winter and the earliest intimations of warmth. The Sunday timing was also deliberate, a nod toward the Christian calendar that Morrison used, a day when no one would be expected to be about their ordinary business, a day when a gathering of families at the Walker homestead would look, from any sufficient distance, like a Sunday meal. Hartwell arrived before dawn. He had been told to arrive before dawn, and he did, walking through the dark from the outbuilding, where he had been given a room for the duration of his stay, his breath making small white clouds in air that was close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky above the hemlocks was still fully dark, pricked with stars, and the only light came from within the Walker cabin, a warm yellow rectangle of firelight in the blackness. Inside, the furniture had been moved. The central room of the cabin, ordinarily a comfortable, somewhat cluttered space of chairs, and a large table and shelves of books and jars and tools, and the accumulated domestic miscellany of a large family, had been cleared to the walls. The central hearth, which normally held a cooking fire, had been cleaned of all ash and laid with a new fire of specific woods. Aggie would tell him later. Cherry wood for the east, cedar for the west, hickory for the north, and for the south, apple wood from the tree that James Walker had planted in the 1770s, and that still stood in the clearing behind the cabin, its trunk now thicker than Hartwell's arms could encircle. The fire was burning quietly when he arrived, not the aggressive blaze of a cooking fire, but a steady, careful burn, with a warmth that seemed to fill the room differently than an ordinary fire, softer, more distributed, though Hartwell acknowledged to himself that this was probably his imagination, or rather, his imagination correctly reading the intention of the people who had laid it. On the floor, in the center of the room, someone had drawn with cornmeal, the Cherokee tradition of using cornmeal to mark sacred space. A pattern that Hartwell spent several minutes studying before he understood what he was looking at. It was a circle within a circle, the outer circle divided into sections by lines that ran toward the 4 cardinal points, the inner circle left whole. Around the inner circle, in the spaces between the cardinal lines, small clay cups had been placed. Hartwell counted 8 of them. Some held water. Some held small piles of what he would later identify as dried tobacco. Some held sprigs of herbs, rowan, which he recognized from its distinctive bark, and dried St. John's wort, and something he couldn't identify in the low firelight that he would later learn was a local variety of spice bush that the community used as a specific addition to this ceremony, and no other. Between each pair of cups, a small, smooth river stone. The river stones. He should mention the river stones. Aggie had told him about the river stones in their preparatory conversations, and they had struck him as one of the most beautiful elements of the whole ceremony. Each family in the community had its own stone, selected from the same stretch of river, a half-mile of the Hiwassee's tributary that ran through the hollow below the Walker homestead, and carried to the ceremony each year. The stones were not specially marked or decorated. They were simply stones from that river, rounded by water, each held in a specific family's keeping from one year to the next. The act of carrying the stone to the ceremony and placing it in the circle was, in Aggie's description, a way of saying, I was here last year. I am here this year. This place connects them. You carry the river with you, she had said. You put it in the circle, and it's the same river it was last year. It's always moving, but it's always the same river. People arrived gradually in the hour before dawn. They arrived in silence. This was part of the ceremony's structure, the dumb supper element that James Walker's tradition had contributed, the silence that marked a threshold between ordinary time and sacred time. No greetings, no conversation. Each person or family unit entered the cabin, removed their shoes at the door, a Cherokee convention that Hartwell had not seen in Scots-Irish practice, and that felt, in this context, enormously meaningful. The deliberate leaving of the outside world at the door, the barefoot contact with the wooden floor as a kind of grounding, placed their river stone in its position in the circle, and took their seat in the ring of chairs and cushions and blankets that had been arranged around the cornmeal circle. There were 18 people present, including Hartwell. He had been given a seat in the circle, not placed outside as an observer, but inside as a participant, a decision Aggie had made and explained to him the day before. You're in the circle, or you're not here at all. You can't watch this from outside. Watching from outside is not what it is. If you want to understand it, you have to be in it. He had asked if that was appropriate, given that he was neither Cherokee nor Scots-Irish, but something else entirely. New England, Protestant in a different register, educated in traditions that had nothing to do with either of the streams flowing into this ceremony. She had looked at him with that particular expression again, the one that held complexity without resolving it. That's exactly right, she said. You're a third thing, just like us. In the circle, the seating was alternating. Cherokee descended and Scots-Irish descended in alternating seats, with the blended families in between, literally embodying the mixing that the ceremony enacted symbolically. Hartwell had been placed between an elderly Cherokee man, whose name he renders in his field notes as Yonah, bear, in English, and a young woman named Bessie McPhee, Duncan and Mary's youngest daughter, who was perhaps 17, and who had inherited her mother's stillness and her father's tendency to fiddle with whatever was in her hands, though in the silence of the ceremony, she had set down whatever she had been going to fiddle with, and sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes focused on the cornmeal circle with an attention that was clearly practiced, not natural, the attention of someone who had learned this stillness and was still learning it. Granny McPhee was there. She was the oldest person in the circle and had been the oldest person in the community for as long as anyone could remember. Her actual age, a matter of productive uncertainty. She claimed 80, and others suspected she had lost count somewhere around 75, though she retained a clarity of mind and a severity of manner that made the question feel somewhat academic. She was the keeper of the Scots-Irish elements of the ceremony, as Aggie was the keeper of the Cherokee elements, and they had been doing this together for so long that the distinction between their roles had become largely ceremonial in itself. They knew each other's parts as well as their own, could have performed either, and maintained the distinction, not because it was practically necessary, but because the distinction was itself a piece of the meaning. You needed to be able to see the two threads to understand that a cloth had been woven. Aggie entered last. She carried the braid. She had made it the night before, in private, in the way that certain preparations for certain ceremonies are properly made. Alone, in concentration, with full attention. The braid was perhaps 8 inches long, a tight, even weaving of the 3 components. The dried ginseng root, pale and forked, the dried valerian stalk, darker and more fibrous, and the third element, which this year was a sprig of dried wild bergamot, a plant that grew at the edge of the community's kitchen garden, and that Hartwell had seen Aggie tend with particular care through the summer. Wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, a relative of the cultivated bee balm, was a plant with deep significance in both traditions, used in Cherokee, medicine, as a treatment for respiratory ailments, and as a ceremonial purifying herb, and recognized in Scots-Irish folk botany as a relative of the thymes and mints that appeared in British folk magic as plants of protection and clarity. It was not, in the strict sense, the same plant in both traditions, but it was the same plant in this community's tradition, where the two recognitions had merged into a single understanding. Aggie walked to the center of the circle without speaking and knelt at the small clay bowl that had been set there. She placed the braid in the bowl. She did not light it yet. She knelt, and the room was entirely silent, and the fire in the hearth burned steadily, and the stars outside, Hartwell could see them through the single window of the cleared room, were beginning, just barely beginning, to fade at the eastern edge of the sky. Then Granny McPhee began to play. This was the thing Hartwell had not been told about in advance, or rather, had been told about in a way that had not prepared him for what it actually sounded like. Duncan McPhee was the fiddle player in ordinary times, but at the ceremony, it was always Granny McPhee who played, on an instrument that was, visibly, extremely old. The wood darkened to near black with decades of use, the bow horsehair yellowed, the tone consequently something between a traditional fiddle sound and something older and stranger, more drone-like, with overtones that lingered in the air of the small room in ways that made the air feel different. She played without sheet music, obviously, from memory, a tune that Hartwell was not able to identify as belonging to any specific tradition he knew. It was in a mode that was neither major nor minor in the European sense, or rather that moved between them with an ease that suggested the composer, if there was a single composer, which he doubted, had felt no obligation to choose. It had the call and response structure of the Scots-Irish reels he had heard at country gatherings, the way a melody goes out and comes back changed, but the intervals between the calls were longer, more meditative, closer in feel to what Hartwell, who had limited but genuine musical education, thought of as the more cyclical structures of non-European music. It was quiet, and it was insistent, and it filled the room in a way that felt, as Hartwell wrote, not like background, but like a second presence in the room. The chanting began when Aggie lit the braid. She struck a flint. Not a match, a flint and steel, the deliberate use of an older method, and the braid caught quickly, the dried plant material burning with a thin pale smoke that had a smell Hartwell struggled to describe, and finally rendered in his notes as sweet and green and a little like the forest floor in autumn, like the smell of something that has already completed its cycle and is returning. The clay bowl held it. The smoke rose in a thin vertical column in the still air of the cabin, then began to spread at the ceiling, filling the upper room gently. Aggie's voice, low at first, almost conversational, the Cherokee words that Hartwell could follow imperfectly, but whose rhythm and structure he recognized from his studies, the directional invocations of Cherokee ceremonial speech, the naming of the East, and then the West, and then the North, and then the South, each direction called and acknowledged and given its offering. At each direction, she turned slightly, and the person seated in that direction of the circle, the person who was the designated carrier of that direction's responsibilities for the year, made a small sound of acknowledgement, not a word, a sound that was simultaneously the simplest of human vocalizations and one of the more complex, because it was the sound of a person receiving something, of a person being named and seen. Then the response came from the whole circle. Cherokee and English together, not alternating but simultaneous, what Hartwell described as a chord made of words. He wrote, I could hear the Cherokee words and the English words at the same time, and I could not tell them apart from each other, and I understood for the first time what she had meant when she described it. It was not that the two languages translated each other. It was that they became a single thing that could not have existed as either one alone. The chanting went through the structure Aggie had described, the naming of each family, the placing of each family in relation to the community, and in relation to the land, and in relation to the time. It went through passages that Hartwell could not follow linguistically, but that he followed, as he wrote, through some other faculty that I am not certain my education has given me a name for. It went through a long, quiet passage where no one chanted at all, and the only sounds were the fire, the fiddle's single sustained drone note that Granny McPhee had settled into, and the thin hiss of the braid burning in its bowl. And then Aggie began a passage that Hartwell did understand, because it was conducted in English, or rather, in the community's blended vernacular, which was close enough to English that he could follow it. This was, she had told him, one of the newer elements of the ceremony, added within living memory, added because the community had felt the need to make the ceremony's central meaning explicit in a way that the older, more symbolic structures could not quite accomplish. It was not liturgy in the traditional sense. It was closer to a list, a speaking aloud of everything that had been brought together, everything that had been woven, in the specific, concrete way that you list a thing when you want to make sure no one can claim it doesn't exist. She named the plants, the ginseng that the Cherokee had always known, and the valerian that had crossed an ocean in someone's pocket or seed pouch, the rowan and the cedar, the spice bush and the St. John's wort. She named the practices, the directional structure that organized Cherokee space, and the dumb supper structure that kept the Scots-Irish dead present among the living, and the way the two had been combined into something that did both at once. She named the songs, the fiddle tune that no one fully remembered learning, and the Cherokee call and response that had changed over generations to hold new words in its old structure. She named the languages. She named the rivers, the Hiwassee and the Tuckasegee, and all the tributaries that the families of the community fished and watered their animals in and drew their ceremonial water from. She named the mountain. She named the people. Each person in the circle, in the seating order, east to south to west to north and back to east, was named. Full name. And then the names of their parents. And then one specific thing about them that was theirs and no one else's. Yonah, son of Tsali and Waya, who carves animals from cherry wood so real-looking that the dogs bark at them. Duncan McPhee, son of Angus and Morag, who can tell the weather 3 days out by the smell of the morning air and has never been wrong in the 30 years anyone has been paying attention. Thomas Walker, son of Aggie, and the late William Walker, who builds things so true and level that they will stand after everything else has fallen. And so on around the circle, and when she reached Hartwell, he felt a jolt of something he could not name, a combination of surprise and being seen and a sudden fierce understanding of what this ceremony was doing and why it mattered. Jonathan Hartwell, Aggie said, who came to write down what he sees and who is learning to see. He wrote later, I was not supposed to be a part of what I was documenting. Every principle of my training told me that the observer must remain outside the observed, that contamination of the data by the observer's participation is a methodological failing. But sitting in that circle while she spoke my name, I understood for the first time that this principle, the principle of the outside observer, the detached recorder, was itself a cultural product, a specific way of organizing the relationship between the knower and the known, that was not universal or inevitable, that was not the only possible way of approaching the question of how human beings understand each other. The binding was built on a different principle entirely. The binding said, you understand a thing by being in it. You document a community by being in the community. You see a practice by participating in the practice. The outsider who watches from the edge sees a performance. The person who sits in the circle and is named sees something else. The ceremony lasted from before dawn until the sun was fully over the eastern ridge, perhaps 4 hours in all. It moved through phases that Hartwell documented with as much specificity as he could manage from memory. He had not brought his notebook, Aggie having asked him to try to be fully present and trust his memory, and he had agreed, and then spent the entire ceremony in the dual consciousness of someone who was both experiencing something and simultaneously constructing the written account of it in their head. There was a passage where the river water was poured in the 4 directional cups in a specific sequence, east first, then west, then north, then south, and then a 5th pouring, a small amount, into the center of the cornmeal circle, into the soil beneath the floorboards through a space left between 2 planks. For the land, Aggie explained afterward, not for the ceremony, for the actual ground under the house. There was a passage where a meal was laid, a version of the dumb supper structure, a table set in the center of the circle with food and a place setting for each person present, plus 1 empty place. The empty place for the dead of the community who were held to be present at this ceremony always, and who were fed as the living were fed. The food was both traditions, canucci soup and cornbread from the Cherokee tradition, and a potato and leek stew from the Scots-Irish tradition, and a third dish that was neither and both, a bean and pork preparation that had no specific cultural origin because it had been created within the community and belonged to it. They ate in silence, in the dumb supper tradition, but the silence was not the tense or mournful silence of a wake. It was the silence of concentration, of people paying full attention to an act, eating together, that they were treating as what it actually was, one of the most intimate and significant things human beings do together. There was a passage where the children, who had been sitting with remarkable patience through the earlier portions of the ceremony, were brought to the center of the circle, one at a time, and each child was named and held for a moment by Aggie, and then by Granny McPhee, and then handed to the person in the circle who was not their parent and not their blood relation, who held them briefly and returned them. Hartwell understood this without being told. The children were being placed in the community as well as in their family. They were being given, ritually and explicitly, to the whole circle. And then, at the end, as the sun came through the window and hit the braid's ash in the clay bowl, Aggie said something final in Cherokee and English simultaneously, the two languages woven exactly as she had described, and the whole circle, all 18 people, took the hand of the person on their right and the person on their left and held on, and the fiddle played, and the fire burned down. Hartwell sat there with the old man Yona's dry, warm hand in his right hand, and young Bessie McPhee's cool, nervous hand in his left hand, and he held on, and he watched the smoke from the braid's ash still faintly rising in the winter morning light, and he tried to understand what he was feeling. He would spend a long time, in the weeks and months that followed, trying to put what he felt in that moment into words, and he never quite managed it to his own satisfaction. The closest he got, in a journal entry written several weeks after the ceremony, was this: I have been in churches. I have been in lecture halls and libraries. I have been in the wilderness, alone, watching things that I knew I was the first white man to see. None of those things felt like what sitting in that circle felt like. What it felt like was that I was watching something true. Not true in the religious sense. I am not arguing for the metaphysical claims of any tradition. But true in the sense that a well-built thing is true, level and square and exact. They had built something that worked. They had built a way of being together that held the complexity of who they were rather than reducing it. It worked the way the best things work, not in spite of what it contained, but because of it. He wrote the manuscript that spring. He worked on it through March and April in the outbuilding that had become his study, burning through candles in the evenings after the community had gone quiet. He had promised Aggie he would show her the full text before he sent it anywhere, and he did. He read sections of it aloud to her on the front porch over 3 afternoons in late April, while the dogwoods bloomed around the hollow in their particular, spectacular way, the white flowers almost luminous against the dark hemlock trunks. She listened without interrupting. When he finished the section on the ceremony itself, she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "That's right. That's what it is." He asked if there was anything she wanted him to change. "You said I looked at you like I felt sorry for you when you asked if the ceremony was powerful," she said. I didn't feel sorry for you. I felt patient. There's a difference. He changed it. He sent the manuscript to Gallatin in May 1839 with a letter explaining the context and the community and his conviction that what he had documented was of extraordinary importance, not merely as a record of Cherokee ceremonial practice, which it also was, but as evidence of something that he believed the academic community and the political community both needed urgently to understand: that the enforced separation of Cherokee and white Appalachian communities was not restoring a natural state of separation, but destroying a state of integration that had developed organically over generations, and that had produced something neither culture had produced alone. The argument for removal, he wrote to Gallatin, rests on the premise that these two peoples cannot live together, cannot make a shared life, cannot construct a shared culture. What I have documented in Cherokee County refutes this premise not in theory, but in practice, not in aspiration, but in actuality. There's a community living proof of the argument against removal, and it is being torn apart, and I believe a record of what it was and what it made is the most urgent thing I can put my name to. Gallatin was 78 years old and had 2 more years to live. He received the manuscript with evident excitement, wrote back within 3 weeks calling it the most significant field document I have received in my many years of this work, and moved to prepare it for inclusion in a larger publication on North American cultural synthesis. He submitted it, as was required by the bureaucratic structure of the era's scholarship, to the Office of Indian Affairs for review, since the manuscript dealt with the federally managed Cherokee removal process. Superintendent T. H. Crawford reviewed it in the autumn of 1840. Crawford was not a stupid man. He was not even, by some contemporary accounts, a particularly cruel one. He was a man who had been given a task: manage the removal of the Cherokee people from their lands east of the Mississippi, and who had organized his moral world around the completion of that task in the way that people in positions of institutional power tend to organize their moral worlds around the completion of institutional tasks. He read the Hartwell manuscript with, presumably, the intelligence it deserved, and he understood it perfectly. He understood it better, in some respects, than Gallatin had, because Gallatin had read it as a scholar, as evidence about the past, while Crawford read it as a bureaucrat, as a threat to the present. The manuscript did not argue against removal. Hartwell had not been so undiplomatic as to make explicit political arguments in a scholarly document. But the manuscript documented, in careful and specific detail, a community of integrated Cherokee and Scots-Irish families who had been living together for 3 generations, who had developed a shared cultural practice, who had done precisely the thing that the rhetoric of removal insisted was impossible. The removal argument needed the Cherokee to be irreconcilably different from white Americans, needed them to be, at the minimum, a separate people who could not be integrated into American society. The Hartwell manuscript demonstrated, with the quiet, devastating force of simple documentation, that integration had already occurred. In at least one community, in at least one hollow in the mountains of North Carolina, the separation that removal claimed to be the natural and inevitable condition of the two peoples had already been undone by the simple daily choices of people who had decided to live together. Crawford's classification note, which survived in the Office of Indian Affairs records and which Dr. Sarah Crow located in 2018, reads as follows. The Hartwell document, while of academic interest, is judged inflammatory in the current political climate and likely to create public confusion regarding the nature and necessity of the removal policy. The document is to be withheld from publication until such time as the relocation of the Cherokee people is complete and settled, at which point the question of its release may be reconsidered. He signed it. He filed it. He moved on to the next item on his desk. The relocation of the Cherokee people, of course, was never complete and settled in any sense that would have allowed Crawford's hypothetical reconsidering of the document's release. The Trail of Tears was not an event with a clean ending. It was a catastrophe that unfolded in phases. The roundup that began in the summer of 1838, in which soldiers under the command of General Winfield Scott moved through the mountains and valleys of North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, gathering Cherokee families from their homes at gunpoint and placing them in stockades to await the march west. The marches themselves, in the autumn and winter of 1838 to 1839, through terrain and weather that killed an estimated 4,000 people, perhaps a quarter of the entire Cherokee population. Captain Thomas Kirk arrived in Cherokee County in August of 1838. Hartwell was still there. He'd intended to leave in the spring, but had found himself, for reasons he struggled to articulate to himself, unable to go. He had told himself he was completing his field notes. He had told himself he was waiting for Gallatin's initial response. He had told himself various things that he knew were rationalizations and beneath which lay a simpler truth. He could not bring himself to leave the community he had documented and return to a world that was in the process of deciding that community's fate in a ledger somewhere, adding and subtracting human lives with the bloodless efficiency of administrative violence. Kirk was a competent soldier and, by the standards of his assignment, not among the worst of them. He did not encourage or permit casual cruelty. He read his orders precisely and executed them precisely. His orders were to ensure that all persons of Cherokee descent in his assigned area were gathered and transported to the Calhoun Stockade for processing and eventual relocation. The Walker community fell within his assigned area. The night before Kirk's detail arrived at the hollow, Aggie held a ceremony. It was not the binding. It was not February, and the conditions for the binding were not present. And Aggie was not the kind of woman who performed ceremonies at the wrong time, simply because she was afraid. What she held was something else, something smaller and more improvised, in the kitchen garden in the last August light, with the people of the community gathered in their now familiar circle. She burned sage. She poured a small amount of river water on the soil of the garden. She said something in Cherokee that Hartwell did not have the vocabulary to follow, and that Thomas did not offer to translate, and he did not ask. Granny McPhee stood next to her and held her hand. Just stood there. The old Scots-Irish woman with her severe Scottish face and her 80-odd years, holding the Cherokee woman's hand in the evening light, and did not say anything either. Hartwell wrote, I watched something end. That is what I thought standing there. And then I thought, I am wrong. It is not ending. It is being broken. Those are different things, and the difference matters, because what is broken can sometimes be repaired, and what ends cannot. Kirk arrived the next morning. He was efficient. He was, as Hartwell recorded, not unkind. He apologized at least to Aggie. He apologized in the formal, hollow way of a man who is performing the socially required gestures of regret for an action he is going to take, regardless. He made a note in his register that the Walker family and the associated Cherokee families were of mixed descent in several instances, and that the white members of the associated households, meaning primarily the McPhee family and Becky Walker, would not be subject to removal under the terms of his orders. He said this as if it were a kindness. The tearing of a community that had been a single entity for 3 generations into a Cherokee portion that would be marched west and a white portion that would remain was, in his reading of the situation, a mercy. At least some of them would stay. What his reading of the situation could not encompass was that there was no Cherokee portion and white portion. There was a single community that was being cut in half. The cut would kill people. Not quickly, not with a soldier's blade, but slowly, in the way that cuts to living things kill them, through what they can no longer do, what they can no longer sustain, what breaks down in them without the other half of their function. He could not see this because the categories in which he operated, Cherokee, white, removable, non-removable, were precisely the categories that the Walker community had spent 3 generations dissolving. He was operating with a map that the territory had long since outgrown. Thomas Walker was not removable by Kirk's classification. His paternal grandfather had been white. His mother was of Cherokee descent, and the legal determinations of the era were variable and inconsistent enough that Kirk, making a pragmatic decision, classified him as having sufficient white blood to remain. Thomas looked at his mother, who was standing in the clearing in front of the cabin, with her river stone in her hand. She had gone to the river that morning and retrieved it. Hartwell did not know exactly why, and his expression was a thing that Hartwell wrote about at length, trying to find words for it, and finally settled on this. He was not surprised. He had known for years that it was going to end this way. He was not surprised, but the lack of surprise did not make it less terrible. If anything, it made it more so. He had had years to understand what was coming, and it had not prepared him for the actual moment of its arrival. Several members of the Birdsong family, who were more fully Cherokee by the era's confused reckoning, were taken that morning. Old Yonah, who carved animals from cherry wood so real-looking that the dogs barked at them, was taken. His daughter was taken. 2 of his grandchildren were taken. The other grandchildren were young enough that their precise status was unclear, and Kirk, in his pragmatic mercy, left them with the Walker household. Aggie walked to the Calhoun stockade on her own feet. She had refused the wagon, which had surprised Kirk, and which had not surprised anyone who knew her. She carried the river stone in her hand and her medicine bundle on her back, and she walked through the August heat with the uprightness of a woman who understood that the manner in which she walked was the last form of sovereignty available to her in this moment. Hartwell walked with her for the first mile, until the road curved and he could no longer see the hollow. She did not say anything about the ceremony. She did not say anything about the manuscript. She said, just before the road curved, "You'll write it right." It was not a question. He said yes. She walked on. What happened to Aggie Walker after that moment is imperfectly known. the removal records for the Calhoun stockade are incomplete. Many of the Cherokee who died in the stockades before the march west were not individually recorded, and many who survived the march and arrived in Indian Territory were not recorded in ways that allow their fate to be definitively traced. A woman named Agnes Walker appears in an 1843 census of Cherokee families in Indian Territory, in the area that would later become northeastern Oklahoma. Listed as a healer, age approximately 65, residing with the family of a man named Birdsong, who may have been a relation of the community's Birdsong family. Whether this is the same Aggie Walker, Hartwell's Aggie, the keeper of the binding, this is not known. Dr. Sarah Crow spent the better part of a year in the Cherokee Nation archives trying to determine this, and the record either does not exist or has not survived. Thomas Walker stayed. He stayed in the hollow with his wife Becky, with the children whose status had been unclear enough that Kirk had left them behind, with Duncan and Mary McPhee, with old Granny McPhee, who was too old for anyone to seriously insist she march anywhere. He stayed and he rebuilt, as people do, because rebuilding is what there is to do. He continued his carpentry. He kept the apple tree his great-great-grandfather had planted. He kept the kitchen garden and kept in it the plants that had always been in it, though for a time he was not certain he remembered exactly which ones or exactly why. He planted ginseng on the eastern slope of the hollow where it had always grown. He planted valerian along the creek bank. He did not perform the binding. He could not perform the binding with half the circle gone, with the river stones of the people who had been removed sitting in a box in the back of the cabin, because he could not bring himself to throw them out, and could not bring himself to put them in their places in an incomplete circle. Hartwell left in October 1839. He carried a copy of the manuscript with him, a precaution, the only one that was available to him, and left the original with Gallatin. He had spent, in total, 4 years in or near Cherokee County, and he had aged in ways that were not purely chronological. The man who left the mountain hollow in October 1839 was not the 24-year-old who had arrived with his oilcloth notebook and his letters from Gallatin. He was a man who had seen something beautiful and watched it be destroyed, and who carried the record of it with the particular weight of someone who is not certain the record will matter, but is committed to the record regardless. I am a young man, still, by most measures, he wrote in the final entry of his field journal, sitting on horseback at the top of the ridge that formed the southern edge of the hollow, looking back. But I feel that I have already seen the thing that I will spend the rest of my life measuring everything else against. I was documenting the funeral of something that never got to fully live, a way of being together, genuinely together, bone and blood and practice and belief together, that the world was not prepared to allow. I want to be very clear in this journal, for whatever posterity might one day read it. The ritual I documented was not forbidden because it was violent or harmful or sacrilegious. It was forbidden because it proved something. It proved that the argument for keeping these peoples apart was a lie. And a lie, once proven, requires suppression of the proof. What is happening to this community is not a misunderstanding. It is not a failure of compassion or a failure of policy. It is an act of deliberate erasure. The manuscript I am carrying will go into Gallatin's hands, and from there, perhaps, into the world. or perhaps it will not. If it does not, if the forces that have worked so effectively to erase the living community work equally effectively to erase its record, then I am writing this for no one. But I am writing it. That is what I have. That is what I can do. Gallatin died in August 1849. The manuscript, by that point already in the hands of the Office of Indian Affairs with Crawford's suppression note attached, was not among the documents returned to the Gallatin family or to any academic institution. Crawford's successors, none of whom seemed to have read the document or considered it important enough to make a conscious decision about, simply continued to hold it in storage. It passed from file to file, from storage facility to storage facility, through the chaos of the Civil War and the Reconstruction, and the bureaucratic reorganizations of the second half of the 19th century. James Mooney, the great ethnologist of the Bureau of American Ethnology, came across a reference to it in a correspondence file in 1901 and wrote the letter that would eventually become the footnote that Dr. Sarah Crowe found in 2017. Mooney tried to locate the physical document. He could not. In 1912, a storage facility in Washington that held several decades' worth of Office of Indian Affairs documents was partially damaged by a flood. The inventory of what was lost is itself incomplete. And then, for a century, there was nothing. The Walker community persisted in its diminished form through the decades following the removal. Thomas Walker lived until 1871, and his carpentry survives. A set of church pews and a carved mantelpiece documented in the Historical Society of Cherokee County that have been attributed to him by later researchers, the work recognizable by a particular technique of joinery that his son and his son's son used after him, so that there is a line of this specific skill that can be traced through the Walker family, from Thomas to his grandson, William, to William's daughter, Lucy, who is documented as having built several pieces of furniture in the early 20th century that were purchased by the Cherokee County Historical Society and are now in storage, largely uncatalogued. This is how skills survive, not as documented traditions, but as practices passed from hand to hand, body to body, the knowledge living in the fingers before it lives anywhere else. The knowledge of the binding did not die entirely with Aggie's departure and Thomas's inability to hold the ceremony without its full circle. It went underground, which is different from dying. It became distributed. Different elements preserved in different households, by different people, not as a ceremony anymore, but as separate practices whose connection to each other and to their shared origin was no longer visible to anyone who held only one piece. The ginseng planting continued in the eastern slope of the hollow, not for any ceremonial reason anyone could name, but because it had always been there, and Thomas had always tended it, and it seemed wrong to let it die. His son William continued it, and William's children thought of it simply as a family tradition, a particular attachment to this particular plant, without any framework for understanding why East Slope ginseng should be a Walker family tradition rather than simply a random agricultural habit. The river stones. At least two of them survived in the Walker household through the 19th century. Thomas had kept the family's own stone and had, for reasons he apparently never explained, kept the stone that had belonged to Yona's family as well. These stones, two smooth river rocks about the size of a man's fist, appear in an 1879 probate inventory of the Walker household possessions as simply two river stones, no value. They were inherited by Thomas's son, William, along with the furniture and the land and the apple tree. William's children apparently use them as doorstops. They appear in a family photograph from approximately 1915, visible in the doorway of the Walker cabin, and Dr. Sarah Crowe spent a significant portion of her 2019 fieldwork trying to determine where they might be now. She found eventually that at least one of them was in the possession of an elderly woman in Murphy, North Carolina, who had inherited it from her grandmother, and who called it, without being certain why she called it this, the keeping stone. The valerian continued to grow along the creek bank where Thomas had planted it, spreading in the way that valerian spreads, stubbornly, volunteering itself in the spaces between other plants, resistant to removal. By the 20th century, it had colonized a stretch of the Hiwassee tributary that ran through what had been the Walker Hollow, and local herbalists in the area harvested it occasionally without knowing its history, without knowing that the plant in this specific location had been deliberately placed there by a man whose mother had braided it with ginseng and bergamot and burned it in a clay bowl while 18 people held hands in the winter light and named themselves to each other. The fiddle tune persisted. This is one of the more remarkable documented continuations, and it is one that Dr. Sarah Crowe traced with considerable effort and considerable excitement. The tune that Granny McPhee played at the binding ceremony, the tune in its particular modal ambiguity, its call and response structure, its unusually long intervals between the phrases, was preserved in the McPhee family and passed down through the fiddle-playing tradition of that family across 4 generations. By the late 20th century, it was being played by a man named Earl McPhee at regional folk music festivals who called it the Old Walker Tune, without being able to say why it was called that, knowing only that his grandfather had called it that, and had told him it was the oldest tune the family had. It had been slightly altered over the generations, a natural process in oral musical transmission. But the core modal structure was intact, and when Dr. Crowe played a recording of Earl McPhee performing it for a Cherokee music scholar named Dr. Brenda Swimmer, Swimmer immediately identified the call and response structure as consistent with a Cherokee ceremonial form that she had seen in other Appalachian folk music contexts and had never been able to explain. "It's like the music knew what the people forgot," Swimmer told Crowe, and Crowe wrote this down in her field notes with the particular feeling of someone who has found a thread that leads somewhere. Dr. Sarah Crowe was 38 years old in 2017 when she found the footnote. She was a folklorist at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, the granddaughter of a woman who had grown up in the Eastern Band Cherokee community on the Qualla boundary, the holder of a doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the author of 2 books on Appalachian folk traditions, one well-received scholarly study of plant-based folk healing in Western North Carolina, and one more personal work that had been harder to place with a publisher, on what she called the gap between what we know we inherited and what we inherited without knowing it. She was, in a sense, the person the manuscript had been waiting for, though she would have bristled at the romanticism of that framing and pointed out, correctly, that it had been waiting for anyone who was looking, and that the reason it had waited so long was not mystical, but structural. The stories that get looked for are the stories we are prepared to value, and for most of the 20th century, the story of a Cherokee Scots-Irish blended community in the 1830s was not a story that the institutions of American scholarship were prepared to value or even to properly see. She spent 6 months on the archival trail before she found anything beyond the footnote itself. The Mooney correspondence file in the National Anthropological Archives contained, in addition to the letter she had already found, a second letter from 1903 in which Mooney described having located the original intake registry of the Office of Indian Affairs Document Storage from 1840, which listed one manuscript document, approximately 200 pages in length, pertaining to ceremonies of the Cherokee Nation and associated settlements, North Carolina, by one J. Hartwell, held pending review by Superintendent Crawford. 200 pages. Mooney had found the intake registry, but not the document. Crow found, in a different archive entirely, the National Archives Record Group 75, Records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A transfer record from 1896 indicating that a group of pre-Civil War Office of Indian Affairs documents had been moved from a Washington storage facility to a secondary storage location in Suitland, Maryland. The Hartwell document was not individually listed in the transfer record, but a batch of documents described as Cherokee Removal Era Materials, North Carolina, 1839 to 1842, was listed, and the number of items in the batch matched. She went to Suitland. The secondary storage facility in Suitland housed thousands of boxes of pre-digitization government records, many of them never fully inventoried, organized by a cataloging system that had been revised several times in the 20th century, with each revision creating new opportunities for documents to become misclassified or separated from their original context. Crow spent 3 weeks working through boxes in the Cherokee removal section, with the patient, methodical persistence of a researcher who has understood that the thing she is looking for may not be in an obvious place, and that obvious places have already been checked by other people. On the 14th day, she found a box labeled Cherokee County, North Carolina, 1838 to 1841, miscellaneous. Inside, along with a collection of military requisition forms and stockade population records, was a bundle of papers wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had darkened to near black with age, and was tied with a piece of string that disintegrated when she touched it. She put on her archival gloves and opened the oilcloth. She wrote about this moment in the introduction to her 2020 paper, published eventually in the American Ethnologist after a review process she described in private correspondence as the most frustrating experience of my professional life, which is saying something. She wrote, "I am a scholar. I have been trained to approach primary sources with detachment, to read documents as data, to resist the romanticism that can make historians unreliable. All of that training did not prevent me from sitting in that storage room in Suitland, Maryland, in February of 2018, holding a 200-page manuscript written in 1839, and crying. I am not embarrassed to admit this. The document was real. The document had survived. The document was exactly what the footnote had described. And the document described people, specific, named, particular people, whose lives and community had been destroyed in part because of what the document contained. Crying seemed like the appropriate response. The manuscript was in remarkable condition, given its age. The oilcloth wrapper had protected it from moisture, and the storage conditions in Suitland, while imperfect, had been cool and dry enough to prevent significant deterioration. Approximately 60 of the 200 pages were damaged beyond legibility, and another 30 showed partial damage. The remaining 110 pages were legible, some in exceptional condition. The script small and precise in the manner of a careful man writing for someone else's eyes. The words dense on the page in a way that suggested someone who was accustomed to making economical use of writing materials. What those pages contained, in the portions that survived, was broadly consistent with what the Mooney footnote described: a careful, detailed, respectful documentation of the Walker community and the ceremony that Hartwell had called the binding. The community description in the early pages of the manuscript was more complete than anything in the surviving field notes, and revealed several details that Crow had not found elsewhere. The specific language of the ceremony's directional chants, rendered in Hartwell's transliterated Cherokee with his own English translations, a detailed description of the garden layouts and their significance, a genealogical chart of the intermarried families going back to the founding couple, Ioka and James Walker. And then there was a passage that Crow reprinted in full in her 2020 paper, a passage from approximately page 90 of the manuscript in Hartwell's precise script that she described as the most important single paragraph I have ever found in primary historical research. The binding is not a religious ceremony, though it is not without the quality of reverence. It is not a political ceremony, though it is not without the quality of resistance. It is, as precisely as I am able to describe it, a ceremony of attestation, a community declaring to itself and to any witness that it exists. That is all. But that is all is a profound understatement of what it costs in the current political climate to make such a declaration. To exist as this community exists, as a single woven thing that cannot be pulled into its component threads without destroying it, is an act that the government of the United States has declared to be impossible. This ceremony says, we have done the impossible. This ceremony says, we have done it every year for 50 years, and we intend to go on doing it. I am writing this in the spring of 1839 as the removal is underway, as half the circle has been marched west, as the thing I spent 4 years documenting is being systematically unmade by men in offices in Washington who have never been to this hollow and have never sat in this circle and do not know, and perhaps cannot know, what they are destroying. I am writing it down. I am putting it in this oilcloth as carefully as I know how. I don't know what happens to it after I release it from my hands. I know that I will try. That is all I have. Crow submitted her paper to the American Ethnologist in March 2019. She submitted it with the full documentation of the manuscript's discovery, the provenance chain, the archival evidence. The paper went through 6 months of peer review that included 2 requests for major revisions, several pointed challenges to her interpretation of the syncretic elements of the ceremony, and a reviewer comment that she preserved in her files because it seemed to her representative of a particular failure of scholarly imagination, which read, "The author's characterization of the Walker community as a genuine cultural synthesis rather than a case of assimilation requires stronger evidence." the possibility that the Cherokee members of the community had simply adopted white practices should be addressed more fully. She addressed it in her revisions at considerable length and with considerable restraint, noting that what she was describing was explicitly a two-directional exchange in which Scots-Irish practices were as significantly modified as Cherokee ones, that the resulting ceremony contained elements belonging wholly to neither tradition, and that the characterization of blended cultural practices as assimilation when one party was Cherokee reflected a scholarly bias that her paper was partly designed to document and critique. The paper was published in January 2020. It attracted significant attention in the fields of Appalachian studies, Cherokee studies, and American ethnographic history, and somewhat less attention in the broader world, though a piece in Smithsonian Magazine brought it to a wider audience. The manuscript itself was formally cataloged by the National Archives in 2019 and is now accessible to researchers, with a full digital scan available through the Archive's online portal. But scholarship, for all its value, has a particular horizon. Documents in archives are not the same as living knowledge. A paper in a peer-reviewed journal reaches the people who read peer-reviewed journals in that field, which is a small and specialized group, and does not, in any direct way, reach the communities whose history the paper discusses. Dr. Crow understood this. She had grown up in a family shaped by the Eastern Band Cherokee community on the Qualla boundary, the descendants of the Cherokee who had remained, the people who had hidden in the mountains, or who had the legal protections of William Holland Thomas. The white man who had grown up among the Cherokee and who used his status as a white citizen to hold land in trust for the Cherokee who would become the Eastern Band. Her grandmother had been born on the boundary. Her grandmother had known things about plants and about certain ways of doing certain things and about certain songs that she had called simply the old way, without elaborating, and that had passed to Crow, not as knowledge with a name, but as inclinations, tendencies, ways of doing things that felt right without a clear reason. Her grandmother had died in 2003, when Crow was 24 and finishing her undergraduate degree. She had not had the conversations she should have had, the conversations she had assumed she had more time for. This was one of the engines driving her work. The understanding, deeply personal and professionally significant, at once, that the destruction of knowledge does not happen in dramatic scenes of book burning or deliberate erasure. It happens in the gap between one generation and the next, in the conversations not had, in the things not explained because they seem too obvious to explain or too difficult, or simply because there wasn't time, and then there wasn't time, and then there was never time again. This is what she thought about, driving to the Eastern Band Cherokee gathering in Cherokee, North Carolina, in October 2019, 8 months after the paper's publication, 9 months after finding the manuscript, 20 years after her grandmother's death. She had been invited to present some of her findings at the gathering, a community event that was partly cultural celebration and partly political forum, and partly the kind of thing that doesn't have a name in English, because English doesn't have a word for a people checking in with itself to make sure it's still intact. She had a presentation prepared with her archival photographs and her document scans and her careful scholarly apparatus. She was, as she usually was before presentations, nervous. She gave her presentation in the community center in the late afternoon. She showed photographs of the manuscript. She read sections of it aloud, including the passage about the ceremony and Hartwell's account of sitting in the circle and being named. She explained the history, the suppression, the decades in storage, the century of near loss. She explained the survival of the ceremonial elements in the folk traditions of the area. The ginseng planting, the river stones, the fiddle tune. She explained why she thought it mattered. The room was quiet in a way that felt, to her, different from the ordinary quiet of an audience paying attention. It was the quiet of people recognizing something. When she finished, there were questions, and she answered them. And then the formal part of the event was over, and people were gathering in the informal way of community gatherings, getting food, moving between conversations. The particular social texture of people who know each other well and are comfortable in each other's presence. Crow was standing near the back of the room when an elderly woman approached her. She was perhaps 85. She was small and moved carefully, the economy of motion of someone for whom each step is a considered choice. She had eyes that held a quality Crow could not immediately name. Not youth, exactly, but something adjacent to youth. A quality of still being present that some old people have and others don't, and that cannot be explained by any simple theory of aging. She had heard the presentation. She looked at Crow with an expression that took Crow a moment to place, and then she placed it. It was recognition. "My grandmother called it the weaving," she said. Crow felt something shift in her chest. She waited. "She didn't call it a ceremony. She said it was just something you did. She said you braided the plants together, and you burned it, and you named everyone in the circle. She didn't say where it came from. She just said her grandmother had shown her." The old woman paused. She looked at the screen where Crow's photographs were still displayed, including the image of Hartwell's page describing the braid. She said it was how you keep people together when the world tries to pull them apart. Crow said, "Did she show it to you? The ceremony?" The woman was quiet for a moment. "She showed me the plants," she said. "She showed me how to braid them. She said someday I'd know when to use it. I never quite knew when." She looked at Crow with that quality of presence, that looking at. "Maybe now I know when." Crow wrote about this encounter in a postscript to a revised version of her paper, published in 2021. She wrote about it with the particular difficulty of a scholar writing about something that does not fit cleanly in the scholarly apparatus, that exceeds what the scholarly apparatus is built to contain. She wrote, "I am a folklorist. I study the transmission of cultural knowledge across generations, the persistence of practice through suppression and forgetting and deliberate erasure. I study it as an academic discipline, but standing in that room in October 2019, looking at a woman in her 80s who was telling me that she had braided ginseng and valerian together because her grandmother had shown her how, and whose grandmother had learned from her grandmother, and whose grandmother's grandmother might, if the genealogical record were kind enough to allow it, have been sitting in the circle that Jonathan Hartwell documented in February of 1839, I was not primarily a scholar. I was someone who had been handed a thing she had been looking for without knowing it. I was someone who understood, in a way that exceeds what I can put in a peer-reviewed journal, why the ritual was forbidden. It was forbidden because it worked. It was forbidden because it was proof. It was forbidden because a community that could make a thing like that, a thing that held people together when the world was trying to pull them apart, was a living argument against everything the world was doing. And it had survived. Imperfect, partial, distributed, scattered across the folk practices of people who didn't know what they were carrying. But it had survived. The braid had held. There is a version of this story that ends on a note of triumph. The manuscript found, the ceremony documented, the survival proven. 200 years of suppression, and a woman in her 80s who still knows how to braid the plants together. It would be satisfying to end there. It would also be, in a fundamental way, dishonest. Not about the facts, but about the weight of what the facts describe. The community that practiced the binding was destroyed. Not metaphorically, literally, specifically, individually. People who had spent their lives building a shared world were marched west at gunpoint or torn from people they loved by a bureaucratic classification system that had no category for what they actually were. Yona, who carved animals from cherry wood. The members of the birdsong family, Aggie Walker herself, who walked to the stockade on her own feet carrying a river stone, and who may or may not have been the woman recorded in the 1843 census in Indian Territory, and who, like so many of the people removed in 1838 and 1839, is not known to us with the fullness of a person, but with the incompleteness of a record, a name, and an age, and a profession in a ledger that was not made to honor her, but to count her. She has been counted. She has not been seen, not fully, not in the way that the ceremony she kept was designed to see a person, named in full, in relation to the community that held her, with the specific and particular thing about her that was hers and no one else's. The suppression of the Hartwell manuscript was not a dramatic act. It was a bureaucratic act, a note in a file, a classification, a holding in storage that became, by default and inertia, a permanent suppression. Crawford's successors did not need to actively maintain the suppression. They simply did not look for the document, and it sat in oilcloth in a box in Suitland, Maryland, for 170 years, waiting for someone who was looking. The forbidden quality of the binding, the thing that makes it, as this story's title suggests, the most dangerous document of the removal era, was never about the ceremony itself. The ceremony was not dangerous because it mixed traditions. It was not dangerous because it involved unfamiliar plants or unfamiliar chants or unfamiliar ways of sitting in a circle and holding hands. It was dangerous because it was evidence. Evidence that the argument for separation was a lie. Evidence that the two peoples had already, in at least one community, made something together that was real and functional and beautiful and could not be reduced to either of its source traditions without destroying it. Evidence that the word impossible, applied to the coexistence of these peoples, was not a description of reality, but a tool of policy. The most dangerous thing you can do, in a world that runs on the stories it tells itself about who can live with whom and who cannot, is to live well with the people it has decided you cannot live with. The Walker community did this for 3 generations. They lived well. They made something. They held a ceremony every February that said, "We are here. We are the ones who stayed. We are both things and neither thing and our own thing. And we are still here." The government looked at the evidence of their existence and decided the evidence was inflammatory. The government was not wrong. By its own logic, the evidence was inflammatory. The evidence was on fire. The evidence burned as steadily and as warmly as the braided plants in the clay bowl in the center of the circle, the smoke rising in the winter morning light while 18 people, Cherokee and Scots-Irish and everything in between, held hands and named themselves to each other and held on. Jonathan Hartwell was 28 years old when he sat in that circle. He spent the rest of his life. He lived to 1884. A long life for the era, most of it spent in academic work in Boston that was respectable, but never again reached the pitch of those 4 years in Cherokee County. Trying to put into words what he had seen and what had happened to it. In a letter to a colleague, written in 1871, when he was 60, he said, "I think about them every year when February comes. I think about what that morning was, the dark and the fire and the braid burning and all those voices. I think about what it would have been if it had been allowed to continue, what the community would have become in another 50 years, another 100, what the ceremony would have been, with all the generations that could have sat in that circle. We will never know. That is the thing I find I cannot make peace with, the not knowing what it would have become, the shape of the absence. The shape of the absence. That is, perhaps, the most precise description available for what the suppression of the Hartwell manuscript represents. Not just the loss of a document, but the loss of the shape of what might have been. A single community in a single hollow in the mountains of North Carolina had proved, by the simple act of living, that a different kind of America was possible. Not the America of the official story, the clean separation of peoples into their proper categories, the tidy march of civilization in one direction while savagery retreated in another, but something messier and more interesting and more genuinely human. Something woven. The government's response was to cut the threads. It was not the last time. It was not the first time. The Walker community's story is one version of a story that has been told and suppressed and half forgotten and partially recovered across the entire history of this continent. But it is one particular version, specific and named and documented, and it matters in its specificity. Aggie Walker matters in her specificity. The green eyes and the Cherokee cheekbones and the 3 days of patient explanation on the front porch and the riverstone. In her hand as she walked to the stockade. Thomas Walker, with his carpenter's precision and his box of riverstones, belonging to people who would never come back to claim them. Granny McPhee, holding Aggie's hand in the evening light. Jonathan Hartwell, 28 years old, sitting in a circle and being named and understanding for the first time something his education had not prepared him for, something that could only be understood from inside the circle, and an elderly woman in a community center in Cherokee, North Carolina, in October 2019, who heard a folklorist describe a ceremony and recognized it, whose grandmother had called it the weaving and had shown her the plants and had told her that someday she would know when to use it, who had spent her long life waiting for the when, and had perhaps, in that room, in that moment, found it. The ceremony was not lost. It was distributed. It was scattered. It was held in fragments, in the muscle memory of people who braided plants together without knowing why, in the hands of a carpenter who built to true and level because his great-great-great-grandmother had valued precision in all things, in the fingers of a fiddle player who played a tune in a mode that made musicologists curious and could not say where it came from, only that it was old, only that it was called the Walker tune, only that, when you played it in the right room at the right time, people stopped what they were doing and listened. The braid held, imperfect and partial, and scattered across 2 centuries of forgetting, across the deliberate erasure of the people who had made it, and the deliberate suppression of the document that described it. The braid held. The threads found each other again, the way threads do, the way rivers find the sea, the way people find each other across distances that were supposed to be too great to cross. This is what Jonathan Hartwell saw on a February morning in 1838, in a cabin in a hollow in Cherokee County, North Carolina, while the braid burned and the fiddle played, and 18 people held hands in the winter light. This is what the government decided was too dangerous to let anyone else see. This is what survived. The Hartwell manuscript, 1839, is held by the National Archives, Record Group 75, Box 1147C, Cherokee County, North Carolina Materials, 1838 to 1841. A full digital scan is available through the National Archives online catalog. The manuscript remains the only known primary documentation of syncretic ceremonial practice in the Cherokee Scots-Irish blended communities of western North Carolina prior to the Trail of Tears. All identified community members named in the manuscript are documented in the Eastern Band Cherokee genealogical records where possible. The present location of the Walker family's riverstones is unknown.